O God, tell us what we need to hear and show us what we ought to do to obey Jesus Christ. The first reading today is the chapter of Matthew in the fifth chapter, verses 3 through 9. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God.
Let us listen now for the word of God as heard in the book of Ruth, chapter 1, verses 1 through 22. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethlehem in Judah went to live in the country of Moab, he and his wife and 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one was Orpah, and the name of the other Ruth. When they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Then she started to return with her daughters-in-law from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the country of Moab that the Lord had considered his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she had been living, she and her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to go back to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her daughters-in-law, "Go back, each of you, to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find security, each of you, in the house of your husband." Then she kissed them, and they wept aloud. They said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Who will go with me? Do I still have sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters, go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. Even if I thought there was hope for me, even if I should have a husband tonight and bear sons, would you then wait until they were grown? Would you then refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, it has been far more bitter for me than for you, because the hand of the Lord has turned against me." Then they wept aloud again. Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not press me to leave you or to turn back from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die. There will I be buried. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you." When Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. So the 2 of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Call me no longer Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has dealt harshly with me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned together with Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, who came back with her from the country of Moab. They came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. The word of the Lord. The world is full of stories. Here in the United States this week, July 4th, if we were paying any attention and not just simply getting into cookouts, picnics, concerts, and fireworks, maybe we remembered the birth of our nation in 1776. Maybe remembering all that led up to that day in July when the Declaration of Independence was adopted by the Continental Congress. And then, if we're really mindful historian citizens, we might have reflected on what has gone on since then. Now, it all began with the new vision, if you will, of democracy. It also began with a new vision of the presidency, not the crowning of another king, as George Washington said. We don't need that. But our history has been one now of electing 45 presidents in 242 years. Regretfully, though, our story in this country includes some that were fought at home with Native Americans and wars overseas. There was the battle. There were times of economic prosperity and then times of economic depression and recession, and still childhood poverty. The battles for equality, gender equality, marriage equality, equality in health care, pay, trade, and education. There have been more recent griefs like 9/11, mass shootings, individual gun shootings, racism, alcohol and opioid addictions. All of these things, if you will, that really tear at the very fabric of our lives and the fabric of our story. Our historical story also includes how we as a nation relate to others: Japan, Russia, Mexico, Korea, the Middle East, just to name a few. But there have been successes as well, things that we can celebrate. The regular transfer of power, if you will, without revolution, at the national level, at the state level, at the county level, at the city level. There's also Ellis Island, with the ideal of welcoming the tired, the poor, the huddled masses, yearning to be free. There's been the successes of public education and private universities, the success of volunteerism, freedom of religion, freedom of the press, developing manufacturing, and developing technology that brings the world together, but also allows human beings to move outside the confines of this planet Earth. Our story is long, and our story is broad. But I'll admit, I'm not always a mindful citizen. I can sometimes suffer from historical amnesia and just kind of coast along and enjoy the hot dogs and the watermelon on July 4th. This year, though, was a little bit different because my husband's brother was here for a few days over the 4th, and he bought a book at the airport to while away the hours of waiting and flying. The book, John Meacham's The Soul of America, The Battle for Our Better Angels. Now, since he and I were having conversations about this book, it's the same time I was preparing for today and reading the book of Ruth, not only the book of Ruth, but also all the related commentaries, I was struck in some ways by the similar purpose, if you will, of both of those books. My brother-in-law, Bill, felt that Meacham wrote the book that we might be reminded of our national story, our national history, and the wisdom to be found in that story. Most Jewish and Christian scholars believe that the story of Ruth was written or recorded as a means to call the Hebrew people back to their better angels as well. To present to these people a different perspective or another aspect of their story as God's chosen people. A story of love, a story of belonging, of blessing, of acceptance, of loyalty. An outsider who became an insider. In Hebrew, the word that's used to describe that is hesed. It's about that committed, loving relationship. And so today we're beginning a 4-week series on the book of Ruth from the Old Testament. I'm pretty excited about that. Matt's preaching the next 2 Sundays, and I get to wrap it up on the end of the month. But it's the book of Ruth, 4 chapters, 4 Sundays. We're doing this as part of the Narrative Lectionary series. I know Matt and I remind you of that from time to time because the Narrative Lectionary is a 4-year cycle that will take us through the whole of the Bible in 4 years. It helps us, if you will, have a better look at the Bible from a chronological perspective of biblical events and biblical stories. And so to set the stage for today's passage, a brief synopsis, if you will, of the Hebrew people's exodus from Egypt. You remember that there was the time of wandering in the wilderness for 40 years before they came into the promised land. During that time of wandering, they were given instructions about how to stay together as a people of faith. They weren't supposed to worship any of the other gods around them. And one of the ways to make sure that you didn't get caught up in that was the injunction, don't marry any of those women that aren't part of us, part of our tribe, part of the Hebrew people. Because if you marry them, then you might get caught up in their religions and their gods. So the whole idea was to make sure that you stayed true to God. Now, once they got into the promised land, one of the things that was set up for them as leaders was what was called judges. And the judges weren't necessarily judges like we think of today, but they were military leaders or political leaders. And their purpose was to make sure that the people were saved from their enemies and that Israel stayed true. But what we know, like all of us as human beings, they failed. They would fail and then they would come back. They would fail and they would come back. And they'd get caught up in the mayhem and the conflict all around them. And so the book of Ruth, if you have your Bible there and you're looking at it or remember it from when we read it, it begins with this: in the days when the judges ruled. A reminder, if you will, of the decline and where people did what was ever right in their own eyes because there was no king in Israel. You look back in the book of Judges, that's where you hear that about the people. In the book of Judges, the Hebrew people failed to follow the God of the law. Now, the beautiful short story, if you will, is told in the book of Ruth, is about people going above and beyond the requirements of the law, including Ruth, a foreigner and a non-Jew. In Hebrew, as I mentioned before, the word is hesed. It's about God's faithfulness, if you will, birthed in a loving and committed relationship among people. But I get ahead of the story. A famine had forced Elimelech, his wife Naomi, and his sons Mahlon and Chilion to leave Bethlehem. Now, the irony of leaving Bethlehem was that Bethlehem means house of bread. So in their house of bread, they had run out of bread, and they needed to migrate to somewhere else. So the land of Moab was to the west, if you will, of Bethlehem, and the two lands were separated by a body of water, the Dead Sea. And so what we hear is that Elimelech, his wife Naomi, and their two sons, they made that journey to another country so that they could find food. But they didn't stay there just long enough to find food. What we read is that they settled in and they found a new home. But then the unthinkable happened. First, Elimelech died. And then even as the sons were married, Mahlon and Chilion, they died. And so all that was left was Naomi with her two Moabite daughters-in-law. I'll have to admit that when I read this story, I couldn't help but think of my own personal family history. Now, history, a couple of generations before me, 3 generations before me. But still, that was what I started remembering and hearing. Because my family, my great-grandparents, migrated from Norway to the United States to find food and to find a better life. And en route, my great-grandmother died. So my great-grandfather, he moved on to Wisconsin, where he left his daughter, because he couldn't care for her, and he took his sons, and he went a little bit further west, and he got to Minnesota. So there they could farm. Now, their world and my world, if you will, is full of stories that have been passed on from one generation to another, stories that I heard growing up. And if, like any of the rest of you, if you've gotten into genealogy, Ancestry.com, or whatever, maybe you too are finding out some of those stories. Stories about home countries, foreign countries, old customs, new customs. Stories of hardship and struggle, and faith, and hope. Now, as I read the story of Naomi and her family, and I identified with that migrant story, like any pastor, we always fear that what we're going to do is we're going to read into a Bible story our own story, or we're going to read into it what's going on around us. You know, like, yes, you read the newspaper and you read the Bible, but the newspaper shouldn't necessarily interpret the Bible. The Bible can interpret the newspaper, but not the other way around. And so I began to be concerned that somehow as I was doing this, my story was coloring the truth or the message of this book of Ruth. But amazing, as I did the research and I read the commentaries that were written 10 years or more ago, it seems that the migrant motif and theme has been one of the themes of the book of Ruth since the time of its writing. Scholars believe it was written to present a different perspective to the Hebrew people as they returned back to the promised land, if you will, back to Israel, some 400 years after they had lived in Babylon and lived in exile. Now, when they came back there and they returned to their country, some of their leaders, like Ezra and Nehemiah, they were telling the men that they needed to divorce those foreign wives that they had had for years. They needed to divorce them because now they were back in Israel. When the book of Ruth what it says that Naomi's sons took Moabite wives. That would have been pretty distressing to Ezra and Nehemiah and other people that felt that they needed to follow the law so strictly. But in the book of Ruth, we hear another story. We hear that there can be something different. There can be goodness, there can be faithfulness, there can be covenant love. In Hebrew language, there can truly be hesed in unexpected places. It was a joining together, if you will, of their stories with a God who welcomes us all. Kindness, loyalty, faithfulness can be seen in the care of Ruth, a Moabite, for Naomi, her mother-in-law. A loving commitment so strong that even in the midst of the most vulnerable times, times of being poor, being hungry, having no protection for their status as women without men, Ruth pledges to Naomi that she will migrate to a foreign country and will be with her. She even pledges, she goes so far as to say, I will choose to enter into a covenant with Israel and Israel's God out of love for you, my mother-in-law. She said it this way, where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Ruth, a woman, and a foreigner at that, chooses to join her story with the story of another, her life to the life of another. And so for me, it's impossible to read this story and not be drawn to the stories of so many present-day migrants and refugees. In reflecting on this story, I'm not asking that we enter into the politics of it. Left, right, Republican, Democrat, fences, walls, ICE, etc. What I'm hoping to communicate through the biblical story and with the gospel message that Vicki read on the Sermon on the Mount, the biblical challenge to listen, the challenge to listen and to those stories of people, to see and to hear them below the noise that's up above. And so I'd like to share a few stories with you. Now, I love the Kentucky Derby. And you go, where is she going with that? That seems strange. But I love the Kentucky Derby. I love the Preakness and I love the Belmont Stakes. And every year I keep hoping, that there is going to be a Triple Crown winner. And I've been disappointed many years, but not this year. This year, I loved all three because Justify won all three. And so I also become fascinated, not with just the story of the horses, but the story of the trainers, the story of the jockeys. Bob Baffert, in particularly, has caught my attention, partly because of where he's from. He lives on the border regions. He lives in Nogales, New Mexico, which borders, Nogales, Arizona, which borders Nogales, Mexico. And I loved hearing him talk about how he came into this occupation, if you will, of being a horse trainer. He talked about his childhood. He talked about being on the family ranch and with his parents. And he remembered moving freely back and forth with his friends from Mexico and the United States. They just moved back and forth freely. I had a friend who was many years older than me at one point in time too, but she was from the Canadian border in Minnesota. They moved back and forth all the time too. She had friends from all of those places, those areas in Canada. Bob Baffert, Nogales, Mexico, Nogales, Arizona, moving back and forth. It was a different time. I think part of why it caught my attention, because when I was in seminary, I had the privilege of spending 3 weeks in that United States-Mexico border region, actually right there in Nogales. Most of my time was spent working with my 6 other fellow students in a compound. Now you hear compound, but this wasn't anything like a compound here in the United States. It wasn't anything fancy at all. There were several buildings, and there was a wall that was built around this in Nogales, Mexico. We slept in bunk rooms, and we worked on plumbing needs, because the only way we could flush toilets was to go out to the pump, get water, bring the bucket in, flush the toilet. So it needed a little bit of work. But the most important work that we did while we were there was to feed 300 children in the morning when they went to school, and then 300 children in the afternoon when they walked home from school. You only went to school for half a day. You either went in the morning or you went in the evening. And 300 children were fed in the morning, 300 children were fed in the afternoon at that compound. How did that compound come into being? How did that compound get the money to feed those kids? A couple migrated to the United States illegally, and they sent all their money back to buy that compound and to feed those kids. It's their story. It's their story. It's what they did. Now, when I was there as well, met another woman who I got to hear a little bit more about her story. Not a lot, but one of the things that she did was to furnish dinner for all 6 of us that were there. And we asked her lots and lots of questions. But she had only one question for us, a question that continues to haunt me to this day. Why do they hate us so? Her husband worked in the United States legally, but she stayed in Mexico. Money came back to her to care for their children. He was legal in the United States. But her question was this: why do they hate us so? Now, one Sunday while we were there, we also went to Catholic Mass, and we sat next to a few translators who tried to help us understand what the Mexican priest was saying. It was Baptismal Sunday, and at one point in the service, and I don't know if you've ever been in a Catholic service in which they do that, but the priest walked up and down the aisles, and he sprinkled baptismal waters on the people as a reminder that we are all in baptismal covenant with the faithfulness of God. And then he asked us to all live out that baptismal covenant. And when it came time for the Eucharistic meal, we were all welcomed, even though he knew we were not Catholics. To me, he was living out hesed, if you will, kindness, blessing, faithfulness in relationship with God and others. The priest had heard our stories while we were there, and so for that moment, he joined his story, the congregation's story, with our story as seminarians. Now, I don't know what the answers are to the refugee crises here in the United States or Central America or Italy or Germany or Syria or any other number of places throughout the world, Palestine, another one. But in the book of Ruth, I do hear the importance of listening and choosing. Ruth listening to the grief of Naomi. Naomi listening to the anxiety of Ruth. And then together choosing to be a blessing to one another. Choosing to be companions, if you will, in a common story. As the hymn that we are about to sing says, may we listen to the world full of stories and then share and live the story of God's love as told in Jesus, who shared our life on earth. May we make the love of Jesus the story of our lives. Amen.